my name is Cami, and today we're going to be creating our own custom websites using ChatGPT's API. Have you ever wanted to create your own version of ChatGPT to respond to questions, suggestions, comments in the way that you prefer? Well, you've come to the right place. And so in particular, we're going to go ahead and create our own custom websites using HTML, CSS, and Flask that helps us use Python to use OpenAI's ChatGPT API to create our own custom chatbot. And so by the end of this video, you'll have created a similar-ish website to the one that you're currently seeing. In this case, I've created a website with an AI that I've named RhymeBot. Name is subject to change. It was actually created by ChatGPT itself, and in this case scenario, I've created a chatbot that responds to all of the prompts by rhyming. And so these are a couple fun examples of it explaining loops, as well as it explaining ChatGPT's API itself. And as you can see, it does a pretty excellent job. And so, of course, the style you can customize, and also I'm going to show you how you can customize the chatbot to perform and to respond in the way that you prefer. So rhyming is just one case scenario, but you're going to get to create whatever chatbot type that you prefer. And so this is an example of what we'll be able to accomplish by the end of this video. So stick around for more information. Now, a major question you might be wondering is, what in the world is an API? Well, an API is an application programming interface. It's essentially a way to allow us to connect and interact with functionalities, data, and services provided by other software applications like ChatGPT, or specifically OpenAI. And so often I'm going to refer to it as ChatGPT's API, but in reality, what I mean to say is that it's OpenAI's API that gives us connection to the different data and the tools that they've been working on. So this is a super exciting way for you to incorporate tools created by others within your own project. Let's dive right in. We're going to start with step 1, which is setting up our project. So as you can see here, I've currently opened up VS Code, which I will link in the description. It's a code editor that allows us to work in projects as well as run commands. I really like it. You can customize it as well. And so we're going to go ahead and create our project in VS Code. And currently, I've opened up a folder, and I've named this folder My ChatGPT Website. You can name it anything your heart desires, but we're going to start by setting up the necessary code files, so then we won't have to worry about going back and creating them later. So in order to create these necessary code files, I can do it in one of two ways. I think a generally easier approach is I can go up here and click the New File button, and I'm going to start out by creating my Python code, or my app.py is what I'm going to name it. And this is going to be the heart of where all of our code runs, both for ChatGPT's API, as well as helping our website load information and create GET requests and POST requests. And so after our app.py, I'm then going to want to create my HTML file and my CSS file. These are going to enable us to create the structures and the styling of our web page itself. So I'm going to first create a folder by clicking on this new folder icon, and I'm going to call this Templates. In this templates folder, we're going to store our HTML files, or the files that might be impacted by app.py. So in this case, I can go ahead and drop down templates and click this new file, and I'm going to create just one code file for now, and I'm going to call this index.html. This is going to be where we kind of create the structure and define the content that's going to exist on our web page. Next up, I'm going to create one more folder. I'm going to create it outside of templates by clicking out of that, and I'm going to go ahead and call this my static folder. This is going to be where we can place our code files, such as our styles.css, which won't be impacted by our app.py and aren't exactly subject to change. More things that you can include in static are images, if you choose to add images to your website, or any other code files that end up not changing. So within static, I'm going to go ahead and add one last new file and call this styles.css. This is where we're going to create all of the code that helps us to customize our index.html, but we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. Next up, we're going to want to install the necessary packages for our program to run. In particular, we're going to be using OpenAI's platform, as well as Flask as a framework that helps us connect Python to our index.html code and styles.css code. So in order to download these two packages, we're going to use the package manager that is currently present on your computer. So mine is pip3, although yours might differ slightly. And so if you notice that pip3 is unrecognized, what I recommend doing is Google searching the package manager that's right for your computer, or installing pip3 or a similar package manager. And so in this case, I'm going to start by installing Flask. And so I can do so by, in my terminal, typing pip3 install, and with a capital F, we can install Flask. And so I've already installed Flask on my computer, so I won't reinstall it here, but if you go ahead and click enter, then you should see Flask being installed on your computer. And this is going to download the necessary functionalities and data that we're going to use in our Python code. So after installing Flask, we're going to go ahead and install one final package, which is going to be the OpenAI package. And this is going to give us access to the functionalities of ChatGPT's API. So similarly, you can click enter and you should see all of these packages installing. Mine are already installed, which is why I won't rerun the command. However, once you've run this command, you should be all set in terms of the files and packages necessary for this project. There's one final part about setting up our project that we're going to need to create in order to work with the ChatGPT API. I wanted to start out with a quick and unfortunate warning that ChatGPT's API is sadly not free at the moment. And so, in the creation of our API key, which is going to grant us access to ChatGPT's API, it may require for you to pay an upfront fee. In this case, I've put in around $5. But I want to stress that even if you can't create an API key and don't want to currently pay for the platform, that I highly recommend checking out the rest of the video, as it's also going to be an example and explanation of how we can create websites in Flask, how we can use APIs, and how we can customize ChatGPT. And so you can also feel free to swap out the ChatGPT API with an API that is free or one that you prefer. So overall, wanted to start out with this last warning before we set up our API key, and I hope that you stick around regardless. The way that we can set up a ChatGPT API key is by navigating to the following site. You may have to create an account, and once you create an account, you're going to generate a new API key or an API token. And this token is going to be unique to you, and it's going to essentially be the key that unlocks ChatGPT's functionalities. So then whenever our code tries to connect to ChatGPT's API, you have permission to use it. And so once you have this API key, make sure to write it down somewhere that you won't forget, as you will be unable to access or change it later. And so one place in our code that we're going to have to include this API key is in one final file that we have yet to create. So let's go ahead and create it now. We're going to call this .env. And when we create this file, this represents our environment variables, or essentially variables that are going to apply to our entire project, such as this token that grants us access to ChatGPT's API. So in order to add our API key into this environment file, we're going to go ahead and define our variable OpenAI _API _key and set it equal to your key here. So in this case, I am not going to showcase my key here. However, you can go ahead and replace this message with your own personal key. And once you've completed that, we're all set up and we're ready to dive into the project. Next up, we're going to go ahead and initialize our Flask app, or set up our Flask part of our project, so then whenever we're ready to start designing our HTML page and our styles for our HTML pages, we'll be able to correctly run and open up our application. So this is not going to touch the OpenAI API yet. However, this is going to provide us with the foundation of how to create a Flask project that allows us to connect Python code into HTML and CSS code. And so we're going to go ahead and start by opening up our app.py code. We're going to start out by importing our necessary functionalities. So we can go ahead and start by saying from Flask, we're going to import the Flask functionalities, as well as a couple functions in particular. One called render template, which is going to allow us to essentially load up our HTML pages. One called redirect, which is going to allow us to change our route to a different existing route. A route is essentially going to be the pathway that our code is going to follow. In this case, we're only going to be working with one route, which is going to be loading our index.html page. But redirect helps us essentially error check for more complicated projects. And finally, we're also going to import a functionality called request. And this is going to allow us to request information from our index.html, such as the information that a user types into our website to ask ChatGPT a question. So we're going to go ahead and explain all of that in more detail, but for now we're going to import these core functionalities, and then we want to go ahead and configure our Flask app. And we can do so by defining a variable called app and setting it equal to Flask with the specific parameter of this _name followed by another _. And this is going to access the overall name of our project and configure a new Flask application with that given name. Next, since we're going to be actively running this code and debugging, we're also going to enable our code to auto reload every time we make a change. So then we won't have to shut down our Flask project and restart it every time, but instead it will automatically load for us. So we're specifically going to access our app, and we're going to set a configuration of the app. And that key is going to be called templates auto reload, and we're going to go ahead and set it equal to true. So this is just going to allow our project to reload automatically whenever we're typing or making changes. And now that we've set up these specific configurations of our Flask application, we're finally going to want to create our first and only route that we're going to use in this project. Amazing. Now that we understand routes, we're going to create our main route in our code, which is going to end up loading our index.html page. The way that we can create a new route is by using the @ symbol and accessing our app and defining a new route that we can create. And within this route, we're going to pass it a couple different parameters. First, we're going to go ahead and pass it the name of our route that we desire. So in this case, since this is going to be our main route, I'm just going to use a slash for its name. Second, we can also pass the methods that it's able and allowed to access. Now, methods can be one of two things in the case of a project. We can have a get method, and we could have a post method. Now you may be curious, what is the purpose of these two methods? These methods allow us to identify in our code essentially what pathway we're going to want to take. For example, if I'm getting the code to my main route, what that means is I could just be loading the page for the first time, and I'm not trying to upload or change anything in particular, but I only want to access that page, so I can get my index.html code to return to me. However, post is going to be a highly important part of our project, and so post is going to allow us to essentially upload, create, read, update, or delete information on a certain pathway. So in this instance, post is going to be used whenever we try to insert a prompt or we ask our AI a question. We're going to go ahead and post the question that we're asking, and then this app.route is going to allow us to handle it properly. And so in order to define that code that allows us to handle these two different methods and to load our pages correctly, we can actually define a function directly underneath it based on that specific route. So in this case, since we're creating our main route, I'm going to go ahead and just call this define index. And this is going to be creating a Python function that's going to essentially say any instructions that are contained inside of this function called index are going to be instructions for how to handle these two different methods. And so since we have those two different methods, we're going to want to identify which method are we currently using. And we can check this by using an if conditional that checks if request.method is equal to, let's say, post in this example, then handle the post request. Now, this request.method is allowing us to identify from our HTML code what was the method that was sent. And so in this case, if our method is equal to post, we're going to want to do something. Otherwise, we're going to want to do something else. And so I'll also create an else statement. And in this instance, we know we're in the get method. And if we're in this else condition, where we're just getting our index, we can use a function called render template. So what I can do is I can return render template, and then I can go ahead and pass it the name of the HTML file that I would like to load. So in this instance, I'm going to load my index.html page, and since I'm not making any edits, we don't have to add any additional parameters. Now you're going to see that my code is currently a bit angry because I currently am not doing anything within the post request. And that's because in our post request, we're going to be handling a lot of the OpenAI API calls. So we're going to handle our API within this post request. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and copy the same code, and currently both a GET request and a POST request will simply load our index.html page. And so with that, we've set up and configured our Flask application properly so that we can then turn to working on our index.html page and setting up our style.css page with the necessary components to allow our application to run. In order to check that our Flask application is correctly working, we can, in our terminal, use the code flask run, which, as you're going to see, creates a development server. We see this warning, but that's okay. It essentially means that this is running locally on our computer, and so we can't use it in what's called production deployment. And so in order to open this up, we can go ahead and hold Command and click on this link that's given to us. And as you can see, we've currently loaded a completely empty page. And this is actually to be expected since we have yet to add to our HTML or our CSS code. And so something interesting though is we see that this successfully works as we've made a GET request to this route that we've created, which is a slash. And as you can see, in both of these instances, we're going to return this currently empty index.html code. And so now that Flask is up and running, let's go ahead and dive into creating our index page as well as styling it using CSS. Alright, for step 3, we're going to go ahead and create our index.html code and our styles.css code. And so our index.html code is going to allow us to essentially create the content and the overall structure of our website. And meanwhile, our CSS, referring to a cascading style sheet, is going to allow us to beautify our website or add different style elements to it. We're going to go ahead and open up our index.html page, and we're going to start by defining the basic structure of all index.html pages. In order to properly set it up, we're going to start by adding what we call a document type and specifying that we're going to be working with an HTML document. And in HTML, we're going to refer to these elements within these specific kind of Pac-Man symbols or less than or greater than symbols as HTML tags. So we're going to start by creating our overarching HTML tag, and this is going to essentially say anything in between the start of this tag and the end of this tag, the end is denoted with the slash, is going to be HTML code. Now within our HTML code, we're going to have two main sections. We can create a comment in our code by the following syntax, but we're going to go ahead and have the heading of our HTML code containing links and importing libraries. And we're also going to have the body of our code containing all visual elements of our code. This is going to allow us to create the overarching structure for our site. So we're going to go ahead and start by defining our head. And so within our head, we should not have any visual elements, but only links and importing libraries. And so in our head, for example, we're going to create the link to our CSS code. And we can create this link by defining a link with a relation, or an REL, of a style sheet. And now this is just defining that this is going to be the styling for the rest of our code, and then we can provide it with a reference point, and this reference point is going to be equal to the name of our CSS file, in this case, styles.css. Now, in order for our code to be able to recognize styles.css, we're also going to have to specify where it's located in the code. And since it's in a folder called static, we're going to add the static slash in front of the name in order for the code to know, first look at the static folder, and then identify the styles.css. So after we've linked this code, we can also provide a title for our website by using what we call the title tag. So we can create and end a title tag, and in this case, we might name it something like my super cool chatbot using ChatGPT. You can go ahead and name this whatever you prefer, but this is going to actually be the name of our website and of the title or the tab that we have open in our website. And so for now, we're going to go ahead and only have these two components inside of our head. We're going to then turn our attention to the body of our code. And inside of here, we're going to include all of the components of our application. So let's go ahead and start off by creating a title, maybe a little brief description of our project. And so I'm going to go ahead and say title and description. In order to create a title, I can use one of HTML's header tags or an H1 tag representing the largest title that you can create. So in this case, I might call it, "Hi, I'm your super cool chatbot." And now, if we see that I've added this first tag, if we go back to the code and refresh our website, we see this appear here on our screen. As you can see, it's currently left aligned. There's nothing super special about the way that it's formatted, but that's where styles.css is going to come into play. But before that, let's go ahead and add a brief description. So in this case, I might just say a description here of whatever you would prefer to add. And I've decided to make this an H3 tag to make it slightly smaller than this first line. So if I go and I refresh my code again, we see that this slightly smaller title has also been added into our code. Now we know overall in our project, in our HTML code, we're also going to want to create a form for the user to input prompts or questions into. And this is going to allow us to essentially gain inputs from the user so then we can respond with the output of ChatGPT. And so we are going to next create this form inside of our index.html page, and we can do so by using the form tag. Now this form tag is going to include a couple key characteristics. In particular, our form is going to be this sort of connection point to our app.py code into Flask, as our form can specify a particular action. And this action is going to resemble the certain route that we would like our app.py to take. So in this case, I would like it to perform the action of going to that slash route that we created, so then we can handle it within our index function in Python. Next, we're also going to want to define the method that we're using. And since we're going to be uploading information from our form from the user, we're going to go ahead and be using a post method. Amazing. So now if we refresh our code, we see that nothing has actually changed, and that's because we have yet to actually provide a field for the user to input values into. So inside of our form, we're going to create an input field, and within this input field, we're going to specify a couple characteristics. First, we're going to give our input a name, and this is going to be the field that app.py looks for as an identifier. So essentially, this name is going to represent the way that Python is going to find whatever is inputted into this specific field. So in this case, let's go ahead and name it something like prompt, where essentially the user can type in a prompt, and this prompt is going to be what we end up responding to later. In addition, this prompt might have a type, and that type can be text, as we want the user to be able to type anything that their heart desires into the field. And finally, something that could be helpful is to provide a placeholder value so then the user knows what to do with this empty field. So to add a placeholder, we can define our placeholder attribute, and we can go ahead and say, enter your message here, or any message that you prefer. And so now with the creation of this input field, if we go back into our code and refresh again, we actually see the creation of this input text field where the user can type anything that they would want to add into the field. So now we have one final step for completing our form, and that's providing a way for the user to submit this information to our Python code to then execute and respond to it with. So in order to create this submission, we're going to create a button. And so we can create a button similarly to how we did a form or an input tag, and within this button we can go ahead and give it any specific word or phrase to indicate that this is a submit button. So maybe I'll say go for now. And inside of this button tag, before this kind of greater than symbol, we're going to go ahead and define a couple key attributes. In particular, we're going to define the type of this button to be a submit button. This is going to indicate to our form that we have finished this action and to complete this post request. And so with the creation of this button, we can now go ahead and refresh our page, and as you can see, we have all of these necessary components for a basic chatbot interface. As we can enter messages, we can type go in order to run them. And if you actually click on go, you see that our code is running, but it's currently not doing anything special, and that's because we have yet to add that into our Python code. However, before we move on to adding different style components, we're also going to want to add one final field. And this specific field is going to be a location for us to add our response into. And so after a user inputs a question or a message, we're going to want to load the response onto this page somewhere. It's totally up to you where you would like to add it. I'm going to go ahead and add it directly under this form. And so to add it under the form, I can go ahead and let's say just add a paragraph tag. And inside of this paragraph tag, I'm going to want to find out how to access a specific variable. And a tricky thing is that we have yet to actually create this variable. So for now, what I'm going to go ahead and do is say add response code here. And we'll come back to that later. So if we refresh our page, we actually see that this appears. However, we're going to revisit it whenever we have a response from Python to send back to our HTML code. And so this concludes the additions of our HTML. As you can see, this is very, very minimalistic. There is only a couple tags in particular that we're using. And so my challenge to you is to create your HTML code slightly differently than mine and kind of design it in the way that you prefer. And so one way that we can go ahead and design it that I'll give an example of is by using our styles.css code. So in my styles.css code, I currently don't have anything going on. However, let's say that I wanted to apply different style techniques to my entire HTML page. If I wanted to apply a style that applies to the entire page, I can select the body of my HTML page, or essentially the element that contains all other pieces of information, and I can go ahead and open up curly braces, and inside of it, I can define any attribute that I want shared across the page. So for example, a common one is to choose a custom font. And so let's go ahead and choose a custom font. Let's say that I'm a big fan of one of these that automatically pops up, and let's say that I'm going to just randomly choose, let's say the Georgia font. I'm going to add a semicolon. I'm going to add a semicolon on the end, but if we now go back into our code and we refresh our code, you see that now the font has changed into that Georgia style font. Now another thing that I can do is I might want all of my text to be centered. So one way that I could do that is by choosing the text align attribute in CSS, and you see that it auto completes it here, and I can choose that to be center. And now if I go back to my code and refresh it again, we see wonderfully that everything has been centered in our website. Now, I can also create more fine-tuned styles, and so let's say in particular that I want my input to be slightly larger than this small box that we have here. A way that I can access this in a slightly more direct way is I can create a style that selects all of the input elements and specifically selects an input where the type is going to be equal to text. And so in this case, we're only going to be editing inputs that have a type equal to text. And I can go ahead and specify the height, the width, etc. And so let's go ahead and say that I want the width to take up 50% of the entire page. And I also would like to add some padding. And so padding allows it to essentially grow in size just slightly. So let's say that I want to add 20 pixels of padding. Let's go ahead and see what happens. If I refresh my code, we're going to see that this made the text field significantly larger. And so I may or may not say, oh, that might be a bit too much padding, so let's make it 12. And we see that that looks a little bit more correct. Something else that I could do is I could also define the font size to be slightly larger. So in this case, I could choose like large, and if we refresh our code, we're going to see it makes it significantly larger. But let's say that I just want a medium font size for this input field. Now if I go back and I refresh my code, this is looking a little bit more promising. Now I also can add different things like background colors, or I can specify more fine-tuned what I want my code to look like. For the sake of this video, I'm not going to go into detail about how to do so, but I'm going to go ahead and behind the scenes make a couple small changes to the site so that it looks a little bit nicer for the rest of this video. So I recommend pausing the video now and styling the website in the way that you prefer. And so we'll be back in just a minute. And we are back. So as you can see, I've done a little bit more work in that styles.css page. However, the fundamental features of this website are still identical to what we currently had. And you might also note that in my HTML page, I've also added a couple minor tags, but once again, the functionalities should remain exactly identical. So at this point, we've completed the index page as well as our styles page, and we've essentially set up our form and a location for our response. And so without further ado, we can go ahead and move into the next step. But we're going to now work on the ChatGPT API itself and implement it inside of our app.py code. And so if you'll open back up your app.py code, this is where we can execute a lot of the functionalities that come with generating our API response. And so in order to first work with OpenAI, we're going to have to import a couple additional components and functionalities. And so we can go ahead and say, add our OpenAI API here. So we're going to add our OpenAI API functionalities by saying from OpenAI, import OpenAI with this special capitalization. Now you're going to notice that these might not be able to be resolved. We can go ahead and ignore those for now. As long as we aren't seeing errors here in our terminal, we should be all set. And so in addition, we're also going to want to access the API key that we have stored in our environment file. And so in order to correctly access that, we're going to import one additional library. And that library is going to be .env, and it's going to go ahead and import this load env and this .env values variables. And this is going to allow us to essentially automatically load our .env file, as well as utilize that API key when it comes time to use it. And so as one final component, we're going to go ahead and load our API key using this load.env immediately at the top of our code. We're going to go ahead and start by loading our API key into our Python code. A key part of API keys is that they remain hidden, and that's why this load_.env functionality is really well done for essentially loading in these variables without actually revealing their meaning to us. And so we can use this load.env to essentially tell our Python code that we're using a specific API key. Now we're also, in addition to configuring our Flask application, we're also going to want to establish a connection with OpenAI. In order to do so, we can go ahead and call it anything that we'd like. In this case, I'm going to call it connection, and I'm going to go ahead and start an OpenAI connection. So once we have these lines of code, we've really established all of the necessary setup of loading our key, establishing a connection, as well as loading our application. And so the next step that we're going to want to do is actually handle these get and post requests in order to get the response or the prompt that a user is asking, and then finding a way to send it to ChatGPT and get a response back. And so inside of our index page, we're going to handle our post request. As we remember, our get method is already handled, as this is the step of where we get information but don't necessarily return anything special. However, whenever we've uploaded data or we've submitted that form, we want to handle it properly. And so we're going to start by getting our prompt and validating it. And so in order to get our prompt and validate it, we can use something similar to our request.method, but we can actually call it slightly differently. So let's go ahead and define a variable called prompt, and we're going to go ahead and use request.form.get. And what this is going to allow us to do is access the form element of our HTML code and then get a specific name of a form input. And so if you recall from our index.html page, we gave our input a specific name here, and we named it prompt. And so we're going to want to use the same name here in our app.py code. So we're going to request.form.get our prompt, and what you then should see is that if we print out our prompt, and then we go ahead and go back to our code, and I type something in here that says, hey, and I click my submit button, as you can see, nothing actually has appeared in our terminal. And when this happens, we may need to restart Flask. And so if we do so, if we restart Flask and then we look back into our terminal, we're going to go ahead and see that message, hey, that we typed in here. And so I could also say hi, click again, and just to verify, request.forms.get prompt is successfully getting this input that the user is giving it. However, to be extra safe, we want to guard against the case where someone might forget to enter a message and click to go. And so in order to avoid this kind of weird situation where we don't have a message, we're going to validate our input by checking if not prompt, or essentially if the prompt is empty. What we're going to do is we're going to essentially say something along the lines of, you forgot the prompt. And then what we can do is we can redirect our code to essentially restart this route or redirect it back to this GET request. So we can do so by returning redirect with the route that we intend. You could also specify a route that showcases an error message that says more explicitly, hey, you forgot the prompt, and it could return a redirect to that kind of route called error. But for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to have it restart for now. I'll also delete this print statement as we are confident that that's currently working. So now that we've validated our input, we then want to handle sending this prompt to ChatGPT's API. So in order to handle ChatGPT's API, it might be easiest to define a new function down in our Python code. And in this case, we might want to handle the API requests separately of this index functionality, just for the sake of making our code more readable and easier to test. So let's go ahead and define it, and let's call it Ask AI. And so we're creating another Python function called Ask AI, and it's going to take in one input, and that input is going to be our prompt. Now within this Python function, we're going to go ahead and want to access this connection that we've established earlier in our code. We're going to want to establish a connection to part of ChatGPT's API called chat completions. And so what we can go ahead and do is call a variable called completion. Completion is going to refer to the response of our code, and we're going to use our connection to access the chat functionality of ChatGPT, as well as to access the completions aspect of chat. Essentially, we're telling our connection to go to ChatGPT, and specifically, we're going to want to complete a chat. And we can use this .create functionality to essentially create a new conversation with ChatGPT, whose response is going to be stored within this completion variable. So just to recap, we're defining an output variable called completion, and we're using the connection that we've established to access the chat completions part of ChatGPT's API that allows us to create a conversation, and as the name suggests, it's going to complete the conversation with what it thinks is the best response. And so, in order to create this conversation, we're going to have to pass it two specific pieces of information. First, we have to define the model of ChatGPT that we prefer to use, and so in this instance, you can specify the version of ChatGPT. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use GPT 3.5 Turbo. I like this specific model as it's very fast with its API responses, and it has really great results. And so you can also specify GPT 4.0. This is slightly slower because I believe that more people might be using it. So I'm going to go ahead and stick to the model being 3.5, And next, we're going to want to pass it the specific message that we would like for it to complete. So messages is going to be an array. And in this array, we're going to contain dictionary elements. We're going to send the messages to this chat completions API call that we would like the ChatGPT API to respond to. So within this list of messages, for now, we're only going to have one message that we're sending for a response to, but you can incorporate a multitude of messages. You can incorporate an entire conversation leading up to this moment, but for now we're going to start with one specific message. In our messages, we're going to define the specific prompt that we're sending to ChatGPT, and we're going to do so by creating an array of dictionary elements inside of our messages parameter. So in particular, we're going to start by defining what we call a role. And this is going to be a message to ChatGPT saying, what is the role of the specific message? And so the role in this case is going to be a user, as one of our users has asked us to submit a prompt. So next we're going to add a comma, and we're going to then define the content of that specific user message. And in this case, the content is actually going to be this prompt that the user has submitted to us. And so now that we've essentially created this connection and we've asked ChatGPT to complete this message, we can then, outside of this completion, store the results in something called a response variable. And in this response variable, completion is going to pass us back a ton of information. So we don't need to access all of that information, but we just want to access what's the most relevant possible response and what's the content of that message. So in order to do so, we can define response as being the result of completion. We're going to look at the choices that it gives us and choose the 0th element, or the top message choice that it has found. We're going to then access the message component and the content of that particular message. And so what this essentially does is get the best response from the completion variable from the API call. And so this long message, once again, is just saying with the response, we're going to choose the best one and get the content of that message. And with that response, we can then return this response from our function overall, and that's going to essentially say that we're going to be able to use that response wherever we call this AskAI function. So now that we've created a function to handle these API requests, let's go ahead and look back up to our index code, specifically to where we want to send this prompt to ChatGPT's API. So what we can then do here is we can define something, let's say our output, or essentially what we want to load into our website, to be equal to calling this function that we've created, AskAI, with the given prompt that we've currently stored up here. And so we know that this prompt isn't empty, so we shouldn't have to worry about errors in that regard. And so once we have this output, what we can then do, just to once again check that it's working, let's go ahead and print the output of this code. So what I'm going to do is, since we've made a lot of changes, I'm going to stop Flask by using Control-C, and then restart Flask, and let's take a look at what happens. So I've currently reloaded my Flask application, and let's just say I want to ask it a message. So I'm just going to say hello, and if you go ahead and click on the submit button, as we can see, it loaded and nothing visually changed, but if we go back to our code, what we're actually going to see is something super exciting, which is we see this message back to us from this printing out of our output that says, hello, how can I assist you today? And this is actually going to be the best response that our connection made given the specific message that we had sent. And so now that we have verified that our output works, what we can do is we can put it all together by then, in our render template, using Flask as framework, we can actually pass this output into our index.html page. And so to pass this variable from Python to HTML, what we're going to do is define this variable from our current Python code and specify it in our index.html whenever we render this template. So to do so, I'm going to define another variable called output, and I'm going to set it equal to this current variable called output. You might be wondering, why have I repeated this twice? Output on the left is going to refer to the variable name that we have access to in our index.html code, and output on the right is referring to this output variable that we have here in Python. So on the left is going to be the HTML variable, and we're setting it equal to the value of our Python variable. So as one final step, we can actually then take our output here, and we can go back into our index.html page, and now we want to access the results of this specific variable. So here, down at the bottom where we stored a location to add our response into, we can replace this add response code here, and we can use syntax that we call Jinja syntax, where we can open 2 curly braces and close 2 curly braces, and within it we have access to that variable that we created in Python. So in that case, we called our variable output, and so now what this should do is load the variable that our app.py rendered here with the output of our AI call. So what this should do now is load the output that we created through our Python code. So let's go ahead and once again go back and restart Flask. Now that we've refreshed our code, what we can then do is once again type in the same message, for example, hi, and when I click submit, we're going to see something super exciting, which is we're going to see a response from ChatGPT's API that says, hello, how can I assist you today? And so I could tell it to do anything. For example, explain APIs to me. And if you give it a little bit of time to load, we're actually going to see this really cool description that's generated by our code and updated here. And so with that, we've successfully created our Flask application, we've configured the app, we've created our website code, and we've also successfully included ChatGPT's API into our Python code. However, I wanted to showcase one other exciting use case of ChatGPT's API, and that's going to lead us into the final step of this video, where you can customize this API to better respond in the way that you prefer. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. So a cool final step of our code is that we can actually customize the type of response that ChatGPT is going to give us. So let's say that I find this response to be a little bit boring and I want to make it a bit more exciting. So what I can also do is create a new message in our code that specifically plays a different role. So let's go ahead and say that I've defined the prompt that I want to send, but let's say that I also want to specify an instruction to ChatGPT on how to handle this message. So I'm going to go ahead in my messages array, create a new message, and I'm going to define the role as something slightly different. And I'm going to define the role as system. Now, system is essentially going to be us, the coder, providing instructions to ChatGPT on how we want it to respond. And the content of our message is going to be an explanation of what we want ChatGPT to do. I'm going to go ahead and provide the instruction to answer each question through rhyming. So with Tortured Poets Department, Taylor Swift's newest album coming out here on Friday, I want us to get into the poetry theme, and so I'm going to specifically say, like a poem, where I want ChatGPT to answer in the style of a poem. So let's go ahead and see what happens. So now that I've refreshed my page, I'm going to once again ask for ChatGPT to respond, and I'm going to say, hi there, and I'm just going to see what may or may not change. And so currently, as you can see, we have a slightly different response. Sure thing, I'll give it a try. Let's have some fun, don't be shy. Ask me a question, anything at all, I'll respond in rhyme standing tall. Now, I would say it does a pretty great job, but something that you might notice through this customization is actually that there's a little bit of an interesting format going on here. And that's because responses from ChatGPT are actually created in a language called Markdown language, which allows us to essentially format things slightly differently. And so a cool trick in order to properly format with Markdown is in our index.html code, we can actually add one additional link, which I'm going to link in the description, and we can add Markdown styling. And now, by adding Markdown styling, I can go ahead and Google search how to convert Markdown into HTML. And as we see, I found a very helpful link. So I've just added this Markdown styling link that you can copy and paste directly into your code as well. And this creates something called a Markdown block that then allows us to change this paragraph tag to be one of these Markdown blocks. And this is going to allow ChatGPT's responses to look a little bit nicer whenever we refresh our page. So if I go ahead and refresh the code, as we can see, I've said hi many different times, it may or may not format it slightly differently. So for example, I might say, explain loops to me, a coding concept called loops. And if I click enter, what we're going to end up seeing is that it does format it a little bit nicer and a little bit easier to read. And so this one looks like a pretty fun one for loops to go through a set number while loops go until a condition is somber. Do while loops run at least one time, then check the condition, it's not a crime. That's such a fantastic description of a loop. And overall, this is just a brief implementation on how to create your own custom website using Flask, which incorporates Python, HTML, and CSS, while also being able to incorporate ChatGPT's API into your own personal website. And so my challenge to you is to create a slightly different version of this code. What can you get ChatGPT to respond instead of rhyming? And so I would love to hear some of your conversations in the comments about your custom chatbot. And overall, thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.